Welcome to the Paranormal Son YouTube channel. I'm JT. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And please don't forget to click that notification bell to stay up to date with the latest releases. You can find the Paranormal Son on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and wherever you find your quality podcast content. Check out our website at www.theparanormalson.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you have any show suggestions or feedback, don't be afraid to reach out to me at theparanormalson@gmail.com. Now sit back and enjoy this episode of The Paranormal Son, where we explore the unexplained. Hello everyone, this is JT from The Paranormal Son. Thank you so much for listening to The Paranormal Son YouTube channel. This is the initial episode of The Paranormal Son. It's basically the beta version of what would later become The Paranormal Son. So please bear with me. The sound quality isn't the greatest. However, rest assured that future episodes you listen to on this channel will be much improved. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Good evening and welcome to the Fortunate Son podcast, coming to you from the land of the long white cloud, New Zealand. This is your host, JT, and if you're listening to this, again, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to listen to my podcast. It's all completely new to me, and it means a lot. It means a lot that people take the time, and I appreciate the feedback I've already had. It really means a lot to me, so thanks for that. So tonight, first I just wanted to cover over a few bits of general information and kind of where do we go from here, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the podcast. So firstly, I just want to give you a bit further of a background, carrying over from the origin story episode that I did. So you may hear the term 40-in. I included it in the notes of the intro to the podcast. So the 40-in is anything weird, odd, paranormal, and this came from Charles Fort. I was really fortunate when I was younger to have read a few books from Charles Fort, and he's now looked at the first real conclusive author that took the time to compile information from newspaper clippings and weird and anomalous stories from around the world. So when we look at things like Unsolved Mysteries and Paranormal, all those kind of TV shows, we really have Charles Fort to thank. He was a recluse. He was a bit of a control freak as far as information and that went, and the man spent hours and hours in libraries compiling the information. So in a future episode, I'll get a bit more in depth in his life and why it means so much to me and why it means so much to the paranormal community / 40-ana in general. So that's the first bit as far as a future episode. The second thing I wanted to cover over is I've already had my first listener request to do an episode. So that's awesome. Thanks for that. So my brother has asked me to do an episode moving ahead about mental health, suicide, and just reaching out. And I think it's a really pertinent topic to cover over, especially right now with the COVID-19, people losing jobs, uncertainty. Yeah, so I will definitely be doing an episode on that coming up. First and foremost, as far as this episode, I want to dedicate this episode to my sister. Growing up, my sister always encouraged my artistic side, always encouraged me to be creative and do things that I enjoyed, and I've never forgotten it. So, Shelley, if you're listening, thanks for this. Thanks for everything you've done. I know you've often talked about the times I would run around with a tape recorder when I was a boy. So back in the 80s, that would be a cassette tape recorder about the size of a laptop, and I used to write and quote unquote broadcast my own news anchoring episodes. My sister and my mom always thought it was the the coolest thing. Here I was, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, recording these things, and here after a 30+ year break, I'm doing it again. So, sis, I do appreciate it. You're first and foremost in my mind when I think of things like this, and the support you gave me when I was young. So, thanks for that. So, on to the topic of this particular episode. I wanted to do a brief intro and cover over some of the most prevalent and some of the not so prevalent myths, legends, and paranormal in my neck of the woods where I'm originally from. That is the Pacific Northwest. So for those of you who don't know, the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. and southern Canada, it's a massive area. Many people think of it as just a huge forest, and look, that's not wrong. There's a huge amount of forest there, but the Pacific Northwest has got everything from glaciers to deserts and everything in between. So, I mean, it's a huge geographic and flora and fauna spread, and the truth is, the paranormal, the myths, the legends, these also have that same spread, and that's what I'm trying to get across. You name it, and we had it in the Pacific Northwest, UFOs, check. Bigfoot, check. Ghosts, check. Legends of lost treasure, check. Witches and demons and the occults, check. Lake water monsters, check. So pretty much you name it, and we've had it in the Pacific Northwest. It's something I really wish when I was younger and when I was growing up I would have got out and seen a bit more of it. But yeah, I mean, back then, especially in the 80s, this wasn't something that everybody discussed. So just to give you a bit of a background, we grew up on a family farm. So when I say farm, it wasn't a huge tract of land. It would be something that in New Zealand and in some parts of the world you would call a lifestyle block. It wasn't massive. It wasn't hundreds and hundreds of acres, but we had 14 acres in the woods, and we grew up there. Again, being a only child in the house at the time for most of my life, and even when my sisters were there, they were doing their own things with the 8 and a 10-year age gap. They supported me, don't get me wrong, but teenagers have got teenager things to do. So I spent a lot of time exploring and wandering around in the woods on our property. And back then, when we were in school, we actually could roam the woods and the forests, and it's something that I look back at fondly, but also when I listen to some of the things that I've heard, particularly David Paulides' work about missing 411, I think it's called, and people going missing in the woods and the mountains. Yeah, it does make you a bit creeped when you think back about it and you think of the things that could have happened. So when I was quite young, one of the programs that we had on television, and it was one of the only areas that you could get information like this, in a weekly broadcast, was a program called Unsolved Mysteries, and it was hosted by an older actor named Robert Stack, who's been long gone. And this program was, they covered everything. So they would cover things like, people wanted by the FBI, but the things that I really loved were the mysteries. So they would have UFO encounters. They would have, I remember them covering over Amelia Earhart. Another subject that ties directly into this episode was the legend of D.B. Cooper, who was a hijacker who escaped from jumped from a plane in 1971 with $200,000 cash, and they never found him. So we had a very furtive landscape growing up in the 80s, and I think although there were older programs from the 60s and 70s, I think this was when people really started getting into some of these things. I would say especially Sasquatch at that time really started to get its national track within the U.S. So just to give you a brief overview about Pacific Northwest legends, myths, etc. So in my mind, the three largest ones, the most well-known, the first one would be the D.B. Cooper case that I just alluded to.
So D.B. Cooper basically was never found. There have been rumors and there have been stories that, it was this person or that person, but he's never been found. The FBI had the case open, I know for a fact, into, the late 2010s. I'm not sure if it's still open now, but all they ever found was about $5,400 buried along the banks of the Columbia River in 1980. It was somewhat decomposed, but they tracked the serial numbers back to the money that the person had when they jumped off the plane. So if anyone's ever heard of D.B. Cooper, that happened in Washington State, and the plane he hijacked, he asked them to fly to Mexico, and somewhere between Seattle, Tacoma, and Nevada, he jumped out because the plane landed in Nevada and the person wasn't there. I say he because on the boarding pass, he wrote his name as Dan Cooper or D.B. Cooper, and that's why I refer to it as a he, but there are stories out there that it was a woman as well. It's quite an interesting story if you get a chance to look it up. So that's the first one. The second one, and probably the most ubiquitous that everyone knows about, is Sasquatch. So in the Pacific Northwest, Sasquatch is, I'm not sure of the tribe, but that's the American Indian name. I think it may have come from Canada. If you look into it, the First Nation and American Indian history goes back thousands of years regarding Sasquatch, for lack of a better term, or Bigfoot, and the fact that it was basically a separate tribe of human or human-like entities that are out there in the Pacific Northwest. You go into southern Canada, especially into Vancouver and BC, those areas are just massive. I mean, huge forests, huge areas for things to hide, and I feel that, I don't know what it is, but there could definitely be something existing out there that we don't know about or we can't prove. So the third one is UFOs. So the term flying saucer was actually coined regarding the first kind of mainstream sighting of UFOs in the U.S., and a lot of people do not realize that this happened in 1947 in Washington State. So a pilot named Kenneth Arnold, he sighted on June 24th near Mount Rainier in Washington State 9 objects. He referred to them as boomerang-shaped or a convict's pie pan that had been cut. So he never referred to them as flying saucers. The term flying saucer came from the fact that he said these objects looked like they were skipping across the surface of the water as if you threw a saucer across the surface of water. It's quite an interesting case, that one. I mean, everybody's heard the term flying saucer. We all know it, but that's where it actually originated, was in Washington State. Now, one little interesting point on that was that Kenneth Arnold reported seeing these objects not just that time but several times after, and the U.S. Air Force officially classified it as a mirage along with swamp gas and will-o-wisps and the planet Venus. This is another one of the kind of stock standard items that the military and other entities have used to, explain away UFOs throughout time. Now, before I get into some of these other cases, and specifically ones in and around my home state, I wanted to just cover over what my thoughts are on skepticism, and debunking. So, skepticism to me is truly being skeptical. So someone comes to you with a fantastical tale. I was driving along the road and I saw this craft the size of a football field flying overhead. A true skeptic to me is the person who will sit there and break it down and say, right, is there a rational explanation? Can we go through this? Let's interview the witness. To me, that's a skeptic, and that's a good thing, because any cases, some of the stuff I'm going to go through today, many of the cases that you've all heard of, skepticism is not only welcomed, but It's needed because it does separate the wheat from the chaff. I believe that there are a lot of cases out there, whether it's UFOs or Bigfoot or hauntings, that, can be misidentifications, can be tricks of the human mind, Again, I don't have all the answers for this, but I'm open to, listening to it. So true skeptics, I have no problem with. My issue is with what I refer to as debunkers, for lack of a better term. So debunkers are people that will do no matter what it takes to basically say, this isn't true, it's a hoax, you were drunk, so on and so forth. And I found one of the things that really annoys me when it comes to some skeptics, but mainly debunkers, is you will hear a firsthand witness testimony that says, I was driving along road A at this hour, I saw this object, pass overhead, etc., etc., etc. And they will say, I don't know what it was, I don't think it was an airplane, etc. Not all, but most good UFO cases, the people never say, I'm certain it was this or that. They say, I don't know what it is, but I can't explain it. When I oftentimes hear debunkers talk about these cases, they will talk in absolutes. They will say, oh, they saw Mars, they saw a lighthouse, this is what they saw. You don't know that. You weren't there. It's fine to say, my theory is that it was this. My theory is that, they saw the planet Venus, or, they'd had too much to drink. That's fine. But present it as a theory. Don't say it in a factual manner, because you don't know, you weren't there, you can't prove it. Kind of this high and mighty attitude that it was hillbillies, drinking moonshine, and that's the only explanation. Yeah, it just really smacks of arrogance. And one of the things I really don't like is people, thinking they know everything, especially when they've not actually been there. You can study case files and everything else, but if you weren't there on the day, you don't know what they saw, okay? And again, it's fine to say, I think it was this. This is my theory. I've looked into this. That's fine. I know a lot of time and research goes into that. But, to speak in absolutes, it just really grinds my gears, as the saying goes. Okay, so now that we've covered that over and kind of, how I'm going to go through things moving forward, firstly, I just want to cover over some famous, kind of famous or well-known cases in the Pacific Northwest, or things that are kind of world famous where we're from. And then I'll get into some personal encounters and or just stories, things that I heard growing up, things that we experienced or we had happen around us. I will do my best to go through and identify through these cases kind of the things that I've either heard of before I did this episode, or ones that I'd never heard of and I learned about. So going over the more well-known ones, or at least well-known in the Pacific Northwest, the first one I wanted to cover over was the preponderance of river and lake monsters that have been sighted all over the Pacific Northwest into southern Canada. The most famous one that I can think of that comes to mind is Ogopogo, which is in a lake in Canada. I can't remember exactly where. I believe it's in Saskatchewan. And Ogopogo is quite famous or infamous to people who know, a lot about these things. And I remember reading about Ogopogo when I was young, and I've seen some episodes on it. And I always found it quite fascinating because similar to the Loch Ness Monster, I'm not certain what it is, but, I don't think everybody is seeing tree stumps and branches. I do think that there is something to it. Now, if they could prove to me that it was a mundane explanation, like I've heard giant eels, etc., fine, so be it. But it's I think the crux of it to me is it's just that mystery, and we just don't know. So these lake and river monsters in the Pacific Northwest, some I had heard of, some of them I hadn't, and I'll just briefly touch on a few. So we have Charlie, which is in the Payette Lake, also known as the Payette Lake Monster. I hadn't heard of that. I've heard of Payette Lake. I know where it is. It is a pretty big body of water, so I'm not surprised that people would have seen things in the lake that they feel they can't explain. Now, Bear Lake is quite a large lake, and I have heard of Bear Lake. I know where it is. And the Bear Lake Monster, yeah, I'd heard of that growing up. That would be one of the more well-known ones in our areas. Now, for those of you who know, there's a massive lake in northern Idaho called Lake Pend Oreille. It's a huge glacial lake, so it was created and formed by glaciers retreating during the last ice age. And this lake is massive and it's deep. And I know a lot about it because I grew up in the direct vicinity of Lake Pend Oreille, and most of our friends and family lived within a few miles of the lake. This lake is over 1,200 feet deep in areas, so it's like one of the Great Lakes. It's not quite as large with the surface area, but it's a huge lake. Now, there is a supposed lake monster in Lake Pend Oreille called the Pend Oreille Paddler. Some of these, as I was reading them, I was going, that's right, I remember hearing about that as a kid. And I do remember hearing stories about lake monsters in Lake Pend Oreille. And if you've ever been on Lake Pend Oreille, the weather can change very quickly. With the depth of the water, you can see whitecaps and different things. I'm not saying all of these instances were phenomenon like waves and logs and that, but it's definitely a lake where you can misidentify things because it's such a huge area. Another thing that not everyone knows about Lake Pend Oreille is that there's a large naval presence there. They used to do testing in the Farragut area. There was a naval base there. My stepfather worked there, and during World War II, German and Italian soldiers were interred at Farragut Naval Base near Lake Pend Oreille, very close. So there is a naval presence there. So that could explain some of these things. It could be naval testing. I'm not saying it all is, but with the depth there and having a sheltered water quite close to a naval base, that's why a lot of things were tested there. I know that in the lead up to World War II, and especially after World War II, there was a lot of naval testing that went on in that area. So that covers over most of the lake and river monsters. There have been others. There have been a lot of sightings in the Columbia River, for example, in Washington State and Oregon. There have also been rumors, stories, and legends about a Snake River monster. In future, I'd like to flesh out a few of these episodes with some more information. So today is really more of a medley or a sampler, if you will, of kind of what do we have in the Pacific Northwest? What are the things you've never heard of? Now, one other water entity that's kind of infamous in the Pacific Northwest, especially amongst Indian tribes, is what's kind of ubiquitously referred to as water babies. Now, anyone who's been in and around, excuse me, kind of Hispanic lore knows about Llorona, which is kind of similar. So the thing about these water babies is that they will supposedly cry out. The sound, why they're called water babies, is the sound that they emanate is quite similar to a crying baby. And so in the old days, the tribes would go to the water to try and find this baby who was crying, and then this creature would try to lure them in and drown them. This does seem to be fairly prevalent around the world. A lot of cultures talk about myths like this. So this one is quite interesting. And water babies are the Pacific Northwest version of this. So yeah, that pretty much covers over the lake and river monsters. Now, we've got a few cryptids in the Pacific Northwest. Some of these you would have heard of. A lot of them you wouldn't have. One of the ones that, as I was doing research for this episode, I said, yeah, I remember hearing about that, actually. It's a creature known as the snow snake. Now, snow and snakes don't really go together. Anyone who knows, anyone who's been out there, I mean, snakes usually hibernate in winter. Most of the time when we think of snakes, we think of tropical hot areas. You think of the Amazon, you think of pythons. But early settlers, mountain men, prospectors, they described this snow snake, and they said that it was white and you would see it crawling around on the snow, moving around, doing its thing. Supposedly, some of the stories were that they came across snow snakes biting rabbits, so, using venom to bite rabbits and then consuming the rabbits. So this is quite an interesting one, and I definitely want to do some more research on this because this is not, this is not something that I'm aware of, in the world at large. Like I say, snow and snakes don't really go together. And as I was reading about this, I was going, yeah, that's right. I do remember hearing about this as a kid. So this is a bit of a fascinating one. So the next one that I wanted to carry over is something quite interesting. To me, it's one of the more famous or infamous Sasquatch stories. And when I first read about this when I was quite young, it definitely put a bit of fear into me. I'm not sure if a lot of you remember, but back in the 80s, there was also a movie called Harry and the Hendersons. And as I was saying about this kind of 1980s cultural interest in Bigfoot, this is one of the things that I think helped drive this. I know John Lithgow was in this movie, and it was about a family who basically, came across this Bigfoot or Sasquatch and adopted it. And the whole premise of the movie was that these creatures aren't hurting anyone, and there's no reason to think of them as a danger. Well, this story that I'm about to provide for you is at the opposite end of that. And for those of you who know a bit about Bigfoot and cryptids, this is the Ape Canyon incident that happened in Washington State. So Ape Canyon is an area close to Mount St. Helens. Most people have heard of Mount St. Helens because of the volcanic eruption in 1980. Ape Canyon was very close to Mount St. Helens. I want to say it was on the slopes, but if not, it was in the direct area of Mount St. Helens. So in 1924, there were a group of 5 miners or prospectors that went into this area. A lot of this, look, I'm paraphrasing, it's just memory, so if I've got some of the details wrong, I do apologize, but as best as I can, a lot of these, I want to give my true reaction, recommendation, how I've heard it versus going and studying every little detail online and then recounting that. Now, maybe at some point I will come back and say, let's do a dedicated episode on this, that, or the other. But these 5 men went into this area. Again, from my recollection, one of the men had found some gold in the area, and so he got together a group of guys to go back and mine the gold. For those of you that don't know, the Pacific Northwest was quite a rugged area. 1924 doesn't sound like, that far in the past, but in 1924 in the Pacific Northwest, cars were not a big thing. My mother grew up in the 40s, and most of the time, she told me stories of Grandpa going into town in the horse and cart. So, automobiles weren't a big thing. There would have been radios, but they wouldn't have been everywhere. So, again, as Mom always said, welcome to Idaho. Welcome to the Pacific Northwest. Set your clocks back 50 years. So all I'm saying is, don't get this idea that, it's 1920s New York and everybody's running around, seeing everything, and it was just a very rugged land at the time. Now, these guys, and going into this area, they were tough men. My grandfather lived in this time period. He was a government trapper, and it really separated the men from the boys back then. This area, rugged, rough area, and there were lots of things out there that would kill you. You had bears, mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, poisonous snakes, poisonous spiders, you name it, we had it out there crawling around wanting to kill you. So, this is not something for the faint-hearted. This was not, a gentleman, prospector that would just pop out there with a gold pan for a few days. This was heavy duty, when you went and did things like this. So to get a bit more into the story, these guys set up a base camp. They either built or found a small cabin and kind of refurbished it for their uses. and started going about prospecting gold. Now, all the stories that I've read is that the gold that they found was quite rich. So gold ore, when you take the ore and you crush it, it's either really high grade and there's a lot of value there, or it might not be worth it so much. But this gold was apparently very high grade. And so these guys were all quite happy because, they were really looking at making a fortune and, having a more comfortable life, because life back then was not easy. Most people, lived hand to mouth, and, if you could find some gold and get rich and kind of live the high life, why wouldn't you? So these guys were in the area a few days of Ape Canyon, and they started noticing things. So they would notice things like branches broken, or, things in and around their camp disturbed. The dogs would kind of go crazy. They had hunting dogs with them, which was a real insurance policy back then, because again, hunting dogs keep things like bears and mountain lions and that at bay, especially at night when you're trying to sleep. The dogs will sound off and chase them away, even if they, are on chains or in a cage. Just the mere sound of it most of the time will keep some of these wild animals out of the area. So, the dogs started acting very peculiar, and from everything I've heard, the dogs started acting in a very odd way. Now, why is this so important? So I grew up with dogs. We had dogs. Dogs do not react in the same way to people as they do to outside threats. So what do I mean? A dog acts completely differently around a mountain lion, a bear, a coyote, a wolf than it does to other people. So, some of these stories that I've heard that was just guys out in the woods kind of playing around with these guys. Number one, in 1924, who in the hell was running around in the woods just trying to scare these prospectors? There are some theories that I could understand. So it could have been Native Americans, but generally Native Americans, they know what they're doing. The First Nations are not out there, kind of randomly breaking brush and things. They know what they're doing. It's their land. They know what they're doing. And most of the time they would have at least let these prospectors know, hey, we're here. We're in the area. We just want you to know, because the last thing that they would have wanted was to just get shot for no reason. So, yeah, that's one of the first things that kind of got me interested, was when I heard about the way that the dogs were acting. So, these guys, they said, these 5 prospectors, they said that throughout all of this, they always felt like they were being watched. They could never pin it down. They would look around. They couldn't quite identify why they felt they were being watched or from where, but they always had that eerie sense. And I don't know about you, but I've had that sense. I've been in the woods where I felt like something's watching me. And it's very disconcerting. It's something that, it really makes you feel uneasy, especially if you're away from home like these guys were. You're a long way, it's not a simple 20-minute car ride or something, or, I'll just pop into town. So, as the days went on, these guys were prospecting, and apparently one of the days, a man named Fred Beck was out with the dogs and a hunting rifle, and he spotted one of these creatures that they called mountain devils, among other names, and he spotted it and followed it with the dogs. And the story goes that he shot the creature, for lack of a better term, and it fell from a cliff down into a ravine. And, the dogs went crazy, but they couldn't reach it, so he went back to the cabin. Now, the story from here goes that night, all of the guys had bedded down, and, well into the dark, they got woken up. Imagine you're asleep in your bed, and all of a sudden you hear a god-awful crash, and you've got stones landing on the roof of the cabin. The size of the stones varies in the stories, but anywhere from the size of a large fist and up to the size of a person's head. That was that was the size we're talking about. And these guys, of course, were absolutely terrified. The dogs were going insane outside and barking, and they heard grunting sounds and shrieks and high pitched sounds coming from outside, and it really scared the hell out of these guys. And being the 1920s, being in the Pacific Northwest, what did they do? Well, they got their firearms and they started shooting. So they started firing at these creatures from the windows, and they would fire maybe on one side, and the stones would stop, and then they would go to the other side, and they'd start hitting the cabin. And part of the story is that at one point, a large hairy arm reached its way into the cabin from a hole in the roof and tried to grab an axe, and they managed to fight it off. So I'm not quite sure how long this went on, but obviously several hours. And basically, the creatures didn't go away until the sun rose. And, these guys went outside and had a look, and everything was pretty much trashed outside. There was evidence that large creatures had been out there stomping around. And, it just terrified these guys. Now, again, these are poor guys. None of them are rich. They've discovered gold, and quite valuable gold. And what was their next step? Well, they weren't having any of it. So all five of them piled into the vehicle they had, and they got the hell out of there. They went back into civilization at breakneck speed. This story very much parallels modern stories of people who have been abducted or in the mountains and they've seen a UFO, and the panic and fear. Now, at the time, this story was quite well known. I know that there was an article in the July 16th, 1924 edition of the Oregonian newspaper. There were also stories of this carried throughout the Pacific Northwest, and some other bylines were picked up in other areas. To me, this is quite a fascinating story. People have gone back and tried to find this area. I think that this case gets a bit of poo-pooed because Fred Beck, as he got older, he wrote some stories. He wrote books about this being interdimensional beings, and that they, talk to him and everything else. But if you just look at this case, this instance in a snapshot, look, I struggle to think of what else this could be. Again, the prevalent hoax theory is that this was just basically people out in the woods screwing around with them. But again, you're not talking about a park in a city or something. You're not talking about an area that was overly heavily settled back then. So as always, I keep an open mind, but I was always fascinated by the Ape Canyon story, and in future I might do it in a bit more in-depth way. So hopefully you enjoyed that story. Again, I think this is one that just kind of stands the test of time. So there's one other here that I would really like to cover, and I'd never heard of it before. I looked into this for tonight's episode. And this is the story of the Owyhee Mountain Dwarves. Now, I might be pronouncing this wrong, and if I am, I apologize, but the spelling is Owyhee. So to me, it's Owyhee Mountains in southern Idaho. Now, my tribe, I'm a quarter Native American, and my ancestry is Blackfoot and potentially some Navajo. But anyway, in the Pacific Northwest, we had a lot of tribes. Shoshone and Bannock tribes are the ones that, have this legend. However, we also had the Nez Perce, the Kootenai, quite a few Indian tribes in our area. So anyway, the Shoshone and the Bannock tribes, when the white settlers first came into the Pacific Northwest, they warned them about staying away from the Owyhee Mountains. Throughout Indian oral history, American Indian oral history, Native American, there are lots of stories of giants and cannibals, and we definitely have them in the Pacific Northwest. But this one, to me, I find it quite fascinating because this was actually at the opposite end of the scale. So, they claimed that there were these 2-foot tall dwarves with large tails. that they were cannibalistic, and extremely strong. So there were stories told to the settlers of braves out on hunting trips, trying to go toe to toe with these 2 foot tall creatures, which you would think, well, that's, you got an Indian brave armed. This is quite forward, but but no, that basically they lost. And, these mountain dwarves were so strong that they could carry a full size elk on the back. And for those of you who don't know, look, that's a lot of weight. You're talking several hundred pounds, even gutted and dressed. And look, this is not something for the squeamish to be able to do that. So one thing that I find fascinating is the description of these dwarves having tails. Because most of the stories you hear about dwarves or giants or Bigfoot, all these other cryptids, I don't remember hearing a lot about tails. The one that springs to mind is reptilians, and the stories of reptilians having tails that, they use similar to, most of us have seen some rendition, whether in a cartoon or a movie or something, or the eponymous D&D lizard man, and they're using this tail for balance and also as a weapon. So look, I found this one really fascinating. So again, that story is about the Owyhee mountain dwarves. And look, I'm gonna be doing a bit more looking into that, because that's quite a fascinating one. So that covers over some of the more well-known myths and legends in our neck of the woods. There are lots more, don't get me wrong, and hopefully I'll be able to cover over some of those in future episodes. But now I want to just cover over a few that either were directly involving me or people in my circle, or, in our very close proximity. So the first one I want to cover over is out of these stories, this is probably the most well-known that you can find out there. You can find info about it out there, urban legends. And this is the story of the Rathdrum witches. Now, we grew up very close to Rathdrum. When I say very close, in the Pacific Northwest, again, you're talking... if somebody lived within 50 miles of you, that's pretty close. And Rathdrum was, I think from memory, about 25, 30 miles away. We went to church there. We used to shop in Rathdrum. I went to school very close by, so I do know this area well. And the story about the Rathdrum witches, the first case that I could find about it was in and around 1972. There was a cattle mutilation in the Rathdrum area. And again, this is something that I only found out about recently. I didn't actually realize that we had cattle mutilations in that area, especially at that time. And, the story went around that this was a satanic ritual, the cow was sacrificed, to fulfill a satanic ritual or a cult type thing. And I do remember as a boy, people being very concerned about devil worship. And, for example, I remember, parents banning children from playing D&D or having anything to do with D&D because of the connotations that it was devil worship. And, basically it would lead us down this garden path. To destruction. And I found that quite interesting that I didn't actually hear about that. But again, this was not the age of the internet. Everything back then was hearsay and kind of whisper to whisper unless you found it in the newspaper. And what really fueled the fire of this Rathdrum witch story was that in November of 1973, a couple disappeared. So they went out in their car. I don't know the full background, but, basically they left home in a car and didn't come back. And, this is where the story started, that they were accosted, kidnapped, and, again, used in satanic rituals. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is that both of these people's skulls were found near Athol, which is 40 miles away from Rathdrum, so not exactly nearby. I haven't really looked into the background of it, but, in other words, where were the skulls found? Were they found in the forest? Was there anything around, etc.? But I did find it quite fascinating that, these skulls turned up so far away from Rathdrum, which is, where these people lived. Now, there were a few things kind of in popular culture at that time running around. So this was not long after the Charles Manson family cult, and there were a lot of people concerned about, kind of cults luring you in to do nefarious things to you and your family. So that might have played a part in the Rathdrum Witch stories. To get to the actual urban legend side of this, the story goes that you would be driving along the road at night especially, and you would see someone, generally the story would be that you would see a woman on the side of the road or in the middle of the road, and the quote-unquote Good Samaritan would stop to help them, and then be abducted and used for cult sacrifice, demonic sacrifice, and that is the story of these witches, is that it was a group of witches that were sacrificing people. There was a story that I found on YouTube. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it basically came down to the fact that it was a scoutmaster and the scouts, same kind of thing, that he was telling the story of the Rathdrum witches. The witches turned up and basically sacrificed him, and he told the children to go in the tent and don't come out, and that he basically got killed. That is an urban legend as far as I know. I'm sure, look, I was in the Boy Scouts, and if that would have happened, at least, up until the time we left Idaho, I would have known about it, because people would have been very leery about letting people go out in the woods. So that's a bit of a fascinating one. I'm not saying it's impossible, but to me, where I'm from, I could see this kind of spreading word of mouth, parents to parents, and it kind of getting a bit overblown. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I most of the things that I've heard of in our area that I actually put a lot of stock in is much more Native American, type of mythology versus European witches. But hey, stranger things have happened, and as always, I keep an open mind. So now the next thing that I wanted to cover over is a bit of a quote-unquote haunted house scenario. When I was a boy, my parents were separated when I was quite young, and early on, when I was under the age of 7 or 8, around the age of 5 or 6, my father lived in a farmhouse near Sagal Lake, near Sagal, which is very close to Kelso Lake and Granite Lake, for those of you that know the area. And I don't know how to describe this the best. It was a quote-unquote farm, but again, similar to ours. Dad had a few acres that he rented from someone, and I remember us having livestock and having to go out and feed the cows and that. And my dad, his wife at the time, and my stepbrother all lived there full-time, and then I would kind of go and visit during summer or Easter holidays or even weekends sometimes. Well, I remember as a boy being very freaked out by this house, and, I just didn't feel right around it. Now, I do know for a fact that one of the former renters or tenants that lived in this house committed suicide in the kitchen, and the bullet hole was still there. I remember having this story recounted to me as a boy. One of my dad's close friends was a sheriff, and him telling the story about them responding to this house, and that the guy had killed himself in the house and everything else. Aside from the bullet hole, maybe it was just a story to scare me, but I can tell you that on the rare occasions I was in the house alone, if people were away, I always felt uneasy. I do know for a fact that, there was an instance when I was 5 or 6 years old, and it was summer. So for those of you that don't know, summer in the northern climes like this, the sun will stay up until 10, 11 at night. Well, I was just beyond terrified. I couldn't go to sleep. I was scared. I was homesick. I wanted to go home. And it was so bad that I ended up calling my mom and asking her to come and get me. And, she wasn't very impressed by it. But I do remember always feeling uneasy in that house. And look, I was really, really happy when my father moved out of that house. I just always felt uneasy. I always felt watched. again, I was young, so I could have, misinterpreted things, but it's one of those things where I always felt uneasy is the best term. I just always felt watched in that house. So that's the story of my father's house. I'm not sure where the house is. I probably couldn't tell you where it is now, even if I had a map. And then the next one I wanted to cover over was a bit of a dual story. My mother told me a story that when she went hunting before I was born, so back in the 50s or 60s, again, in this area, you would go way up into the mountains, you'd pack everything with you, you could only drive so far, and then everything else was done on foot. So, you'd go several miles or, 10, 20 miles or, 15, 30 kilometers out there into the woods. And it was quite isolated. And Mom told me a story, and I really wish I would have got more information on it because, unfortunately, my mom has passed on, and I can't continue to gather information. But that they basically came across an abandoned house, and this house was up in a mountainside. And the thing that was fascinating for my mom was that it was like going back in time. This house was... There were newspapers and calendars around in this house from the 30s and 40s. And, it wasn't the Mary Celeste. It wasn't, there were skeletons in there and everything else. Don't get me wrong. But it was just fascinating that this house was basically abandoned. And everything wasn't packed up and moved. There were dishes and things there, Mom said, and they did find some things there. But again, I wish I really knew. But I don't have any more details aside from the fact that they found this house. It was abandoned. No one was there. There was no sign of anybody being dead or anything like that, or foul play. But I just found it quite interesting. And again, it just goes to show that in this neck of the woods, look, things can be reclaimed by nature. People don't even know it's there, and then somebody stumbles across it 30, 40, 50 years later. And there's stories about planes crashing in the woods, and people find them 50 years later, and so on. So that's a bit of a fascinating one. Now, on the back of that one is a story of my grandfather's. So my grandfather was a government trapper. He spent a lot of time in the woods. He was born in 1895 on the wagon train to Idaho. So, this was a man's man. This was a tough guy who lived in the woods. He fought in World War I. He didn't take BS. And he would go for weeks and months at a time into the woods with his hunting dogs and go trapping. So there was a bounty at the time for things like mountain lions and wolves and bears and that. And, that's how he made his living. I know a lot of people frown on that sort of thing today, but at that time it was a real wild and untamed wilderness. And this is just what you did, okay? It's probably the only reason that they made ends meet during the Great Depression, my family. So, it is what it is. Well, anyway, Grandpa told us in the 80s a story about a crystal cave that he had found, one time. And look, if I had to guess, I would say it was sometime in the 40s or 50s that he found this cave. We went out there with him. Mom took him out because Mom really wanted to find this with her dad. And all I know is that it was north of Pend Oreille. It was, when Mom was growing up, before they moved into Pend Oreille, she grew up in an area out in the woods called Ruby Creek. So it was somewhere in that vicinity. And the story that I can best remember was that, Grandpa basically found these caverns with, he called them crystal caves or crystal caverns, but he wasn't sure if it was salt crystals or quartz or what. And we spent a day out there trying to find these caverns, and we couldn't, unfortunately. Again, this is somebody looking for something 40, 50 years after he'd seen it. Grandpa's feeling was that the ground had subsided and the caves had collapsed. But it is quite interesting. And again, it's just one of those things. It goes to show in that area, there's just unexplored things probably to this day that maybe some people know about, but people in general don't know. So my grandfather, there's a lot of things I wish I would have asked him. He wasn't a man that talked a lot, but I'm sure there were things that he would have seen, out there in the woods that he just didn't talk about. He didn't want people to think he was crazy, probably, and especially where we're from, small area, not a lot of people. You don't want people thinking you and your family are nuts, or you're probably going to struggle to find work or even buy things from the store. So that's quite an interesting one for me. So look, there are many others. I'll probably make a part 2 of this episode. I found it quite interesting, and I wanted to get some of these stories out because they're unique family stories. They're things that once I pass on, there's no one else to share them really, and so I want to get them out there, and I want people to know about it. And again, if you got questions or comments you'd like me to try and fill you in more, let me know. Drop a line. I've set up an email for this podcast specifically, so don't be afraid to drop me a note or drop me a verbal note on the podcast. So the last thing I want to cover is again just kind of general business and where to from here. Look, folks, thanks for listening. It means the world to me. I wanted to give a few shout outs for some of the people who've just, supported me through this. And, I just want to say thank you. So I want to say thank you to my brother-in-law, Mike. Look, Mike, thank you. Thanks for your help. Thanks. Mike is designing a logo for the podcast, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate his positivity. I want to give a shout out to my friends Harry and Lisa in North Carolina. Look, thanks for being early adopters, and thanks for supporting me. Harry, thanks for shouting me out on Instagram. I appreciate it. I also want to say thanks to Eddie. Eddie's another very close friend of mine, like a brother. And Eddie's first podcast that he's ever listened to was my podcast, and I'm really honored by that, man. Thanks, Eddie. I appreciate it, and I'll do my best to cover on some topics that you enjoy. I want to give a few shout outs to some other people as well. First and foremost, I want to give a shout out to Bun Ling, who is the owner and proprietor of the Satay Noodle House here in close to where I live in Papakura. Bun is a really good guy, and he does a lot to help the community. When I've had people in my family, with cancer and going through a lot of hard things or losing a job, Bun has offered more than once for me to come in and get some free food. And man, I worked 20 plus years in the food industry. I know how hard it is to make ends meet. I told Bun, no, look, there are people who have got it a lot harder than me. Look after them. But this is a real good guy. And Bun is actually the one who's also got me to get off of the fence and make a podcast, because I listen to Bun's, and it's just simple. Thanks again, Bun, for outlaying how you did it. And if you're ever in the area, folks, if you hear this, get in there and get some food at Satay Noodle House. Not only is Bun a great guy, but it's good food and it's good value. In my TripAdvisor, I've given him the thumbs up. So if you're curious, you can look on there. For those who don't know, I also just wanted to cover over a few podcasts that I've really enjoyed, that most of them are based in and around the paranormal, but they cover everything. Expanded Perspectives, which is a couple of guys, Cam and Phil out of Texas. That's a great show. I really got into that in 2016, and it's been a great show, and hats off to you guys. You do a great program. Blurry Photos, which is done by David Stecco, and I can't remember the original second host, but I really love that show. Well done, and they do a great service to the community. Every year they do a Miss Cryptid that covers over some of the lesser-known cryptid creatures around the world. That's really good. I've really enjoyed the HP podcast as well, which is Lovecraft, cover over Lovecraft stories and some others. That's a really good one. And on YouTube, there's a program called Forum Borealis, which covers all kinds of mysteries and kind of the modern world. That's another really good show. So do yourself a favor and check those out. So the next program I will do will probably be my listener suggestion, but I'll keep you posted. And again, thanks folks for listening, and I hope you have a great evening, day, just thanks for supporting me, and take care.